In this video, we're going to cover how to play a Frost Mage. Let's begin by looking at stats and reforging. As you can see from the stats equation, intellect is the most important stat. The most important two secondary stats are hit rating and critical strike chance. Let's move on to reforging. The first objective is to reach the hit rating cap of either 6% for heroics or 17% for raids. Next, you want to reach a critical strike rating of 33.33%. Reforge Mastery first and Haste second into crit. Let's take a look at some relevant and useful gems that you can use to socket your gear as a Frost Mage. You can see some on the screen right now. As a rule of thumb, you want to match the socket bonus, but only if the socket bonus gives you intellect. If it doesn't, then you'll want to socket with a pure plus 40 intellect gem. Okay, let's cover some recommended glyphs for Frost Mages. The recommendations we're going to be covering are relative to the objective of maximizing DPS. They're not necessarily going to correlate to the glyphs that I chose because my goal is not to maximize DPS, it's to maximize kiting ability. Let's start by taking a look at the three recommended prime glyphs. They include the glyph of Deep Freeze, the glyph of Frostfire, and the glyph of Frostbolt. Now the glyphs that I chose that differ are I chose the glyph of Cone of Cold and the glyph of Ice Lance. Again, my objective is not necessarily to do more damage, but it's to enable more effective kiting. Let's take a look at some of the recommended major glyphs for Frost Mages. Now there aren't any real recommendations because they're all preferential. The reason why I went with the three that I went with, those include the glyph of Frost Nova, the glyph of Ice Barrier, and the glyph of Polymorph, are just simply because they fit my own personal playstyle. Let's move on to a Frost Mage talent discussion. Like the talent discussions in the other videos, we're not going to cover every individual talent. Instead, we're just going to cover the important ones. As I mentioned before, this particular talent build is not a talent build designed to maximize DPS. It's actually designed to maximize kiting ability and survivability. Let's start with the first talent, Early Frost. This is sort of an unpredictable talent. What it'll do is reduce the cast time of your Frostbolt by 0.6 seconds, but it only occurs every 15 seconds. So it's not really, it's worth spending 2 talent points on, but it's not really the best talent. Because critical strike rating is the most important stat for a Frost Mage, you definitely want to spend 3 talent points on Piercing Ice, because it does increase your critical strike chance by 3%. Shatter is arguably one of the most important Frost Mage talents. The way it works is it multiplies the critical strike chance of all of your spells against frozen targets by 3, and also increases the damage done by Frostbolt against frozen targets by 20%. Now this comes back to our discussion about stats and why our objective to reach a critical strike rating of 33.33% is that if you triple that, that equals roughly 100% critical strike chance against frozen targets. So that means that all of your Ice Lance spells will crit. Very important talent. I recommend spending 3 talent points on Ice Flows because it does reduce the cooldowns on your most important Frost spells. I didn't spend any talent points in Improved Cone of Cold or Piercing Chill, and the reason why relates to the whole topic of kiting as a Frost Mage. Now, we're not going to digress that much because Frost Mage kiting is in and of itself worthy of an entire tutorial series. What I can say is that in a nutshell, these two talents can actually make kiting multiple targets less predictable and less effective. Permafrost is an absolutely essential Frost talent for kiting, but it's not as important if your goal is just to maximize DPS output. The way it works is it grants all of your Frost spells the ability to place a chill debuff on the target that reduces its movement speed by an additional 10%. Permafrost also has the interesting property of healing your pet anytime you deal damage. One possible use for this is you can use your pet to tank. You can use your pet initially, you sick your pet on something and let it build up aggro, and then when you start casting, it'll start healing your pet. which is nice. Ice Shards gives your Blizzard spell a chance to apply a chill debuff on the targets that reduce their movement speed by 50%. It also increases the range of your Ice Lance spell by 5 yards. This is a must-have talent if you are leveling or questing and you do a lot of Blizzard farming. Icy Veins is an essential frost talent. It does a couple of things. One, it increases your casting speed by 20%, and two, it eliminates any possible pushback that you suffer while casting. Fingers of Frost and Improved Freeze are two of your more important frost talents. What Fingers of Frost does, it's one of your proccing talents that you'll have every once in a while, and what it does is it causes your next Ice Lance or Deep Freeze spell to act as if the target were frozen. And it also increases your Ice Lance damage by 25%. This buff, when it procs, this buff can stack 2 times also. The way Improved Freeze works is anytime you cast your Water Elemental's Freeze spell, it automatically gives you 2 charges of Fingers of Frost. And this fits into your single target DPS rotation, which we'll discuss later. Enduring Winter is one of your mana regeneration talents. It does a couple of things. It'll reduce the mana cost of all spells by 10%, and it also gives your Frostbolt the property of creating this mana replenishment effect that will affect everyone in your party. Cold Snap is another one of your absolutely essential frost talents. Whenever you activate it, it'll finish all the cooldowns on all of your frost spells. Brain Freeze is another one of your proccing talents. It does periodically proc. When it does, it causes your next Fireball or Frostfire Bolt to be instant and cost no mana. It can also take advantage of any existing Fingers of Frost charge that you may have. We'll talk about where Rain Freeze can fit into your single target and AoE rotations later in the tutorial. Ice Barrier is one of your main frost survivability talents. It's basically a shield that absorbs more damage than Mana Shield and also doesn't drain mana when you do take damage. Shattered Barrier extends from Ice Barrier. Anytime your Ice Barrier breaks, it'll cast a Frost Nova around you that freezes everything around you. Reactive Barrier also extends from Ice Barrier. What it does is anytime you take damage that drops your health below 50%, it'll automatically cast a mana-free Ice Barrier. But the Ice Barrier will obey the Ice Barrier's cooldown. So if you think about what it's actually doing, it's sort of like an airbag, except that the airbag is free. Frostfire Orb is another powerful frost talent. It does a couple of things. First, it changes your Flame Orb into a Frostfire Orb, which does damage, but it also applies a chill effect that slows a target down by 40%. The other thing that it does is that it empowers the chill effect created by your Frostfire Bullet by an additional 20%. So instead of slowing a target by 50%, it slows a target by a massive 70%. And the last frost talent that we want to talk about in the frost talent tree is Deep Freeze, which is one of your most powerful spells as a frost mage. If you cast Deep Freeze on a non-elite mob or a mob that is stunnable, it will freeze that target for up to 5 seconds. If you cast it on a boss or boss-like elite that cannot be stunned, it'll deal massive burst damage instead. And that wraps up our talent discussion. Let's move on to a discussion about the Frost Mage single target and AoE strategies.